had never been the type to back down from an adventure. When I'd heard about the cabin in the woods, isolated and quiet, I thought it would be the perfect getaway. No distractions, no noise, just me, the wilderness, and the kind of silence I could never find back home. I needed time away from everything, and I thought this cabin would give me that. I found the place online. The listing said it was far from any towns or neighbors, tucked away deep in the forest. The photos showed a small log cabin with a wood-burning stove, a small porch, and a rugged, worn-out charm. The description promised peace and solitude. I knew it wouldn't be a luxury getaway, but that was the point. It was supposed to be simple, just a cabin in the woods. I didn't really think much about it. The booking was easy. A few clicks, a couple of email exchanges, and I was on my way. I packed up a small bag with just the essentials: clothes, some food, and a few books to keep me company. I didn't need much. It was going to be a quiet week to disconnect. When I arrived at the cabin, it looked just like the pictures, maybe even a bit more weathered. The wood was faded, the roof had patches of moss growing on it, and the porch creaked under my weight when I stepped onto it. It had an old charm to it, the kind of place you'd expect to find in a storybook, minus the magic. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me immediately. It was a mix of aged wood, dust, and something else I couldn't quite place. The interior was simple, too. A couple of mismatched chairs by a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with a sink, a stove, and a fridge that looked like it had been around for decades. The furniture was old but functional. Nothing fancy, just the basics. I didn't mind. In fact, I liked it. It felt authentic. Everything was calm, and I had the feeling that this place hadn't seen many visitors in years. I felt a strange sort of peace settle over me as I unpacked my things. The first few hours were spent exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, and the trail leading from the cabin was narrow, barely visible through the underbrush. I didn't have a map, but I didn't really need one. I figured I could just walk for a while and turn back when I felt like it. As I walked deeper into the woods, the silence was deafening. No birds, no animals, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching through the dry leaves on the forest floor. The air was heavy, like it was holding its breath. I found a small creek after a while, the water trickling over rocks. I sat there for a moment, listening to the soft rush of water, trying to relax. I realized then how isolated I really was. There was no one around for miles. The thought should have been comforting, but instead, it made me feel strangely uneasy. I returned to the cabin as the sun began to dip low in the sky. The temperature dropped quickly, and I noticed the wind picking up. It was the kind of wind that made the trees creak and groan, as if they were whispering secrets to one another. The place was still quiet, but now it felt more isolated. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I shook it off and started a fire in the stone fireplace. I'd brought some firewood with me, but there was a pile outside as well, already chopped and ready to use. I settled into a chair by the fire with a book, trying to push the odd feeling out of my mind. The night passed uneventfully, with only the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind rattling the cabin's windows. I ended up falling asleep in my chair, the warmth of the fire lulling me into a deep, dreamless slumber. The next morning, I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it was different this time. It wasn't just the usual rustling of the trees. It sounded like something was moving through the underbrush. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out into the woods. I couldn't see anything, but the sound continued. A slow, dragging motion, like something heavy was being dragged across the ground. I didn't know what it was, and for a moment, I stood there frozen. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. The noise was far enough away that I didn't feel immediately threatened, but the unease was still there. I had no way of knowing what was out there, but I tried to ignore it. It wasn't the first time I'd been in the woods alone, and I wasn't about to let myself get spooked over nothing. I spent the rest of the day cleaning up the cabin and making myself comfortable. The wind had picked up again, and the trees outside were swaying heavily. It was harder to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, though. It wasn't just the sound from the woods. There was an oppressive weight to the silence here. It wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt wrong, like the forest itself was holding something back. And I wasn't supposed to be there. I decided to take a walk again, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. I was determined not to let whatever was bothering me get the best of me. The forest was as quiet as before, but this time, the silence felt more intense, more suffocating. My footsteps seemed too loud, echoing off the trees like they were being amplified. I tried to focus on the natural sounds around me, but they were absent. The birds, the rustling of small animals, all of it was gone. It was then that I noticed something strange. There was a small path leading deeper into the woods that I hadn't seen before. It wasn't marked, and it didn't look like it had been walked on in years. The ground was overgrown with thick grass and tangled vines, but something about it drew me in. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the isolation, but I decided to follow it. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in on me. The trees were thicker now, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The air smelled damp, and the wind had stopped entirely. There was only the sound of my feet moving through the underbrush. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being led somewhere, though I didn't know where. Eventually, I reached a clearing, and at the center of it stood an old shed. It was made of the same weathered wood as the cabin, but this one looked even older. The roof was half collapsed, and the walls were covered in moss. The door hung crooked on its hinges, as if it hadn't been opened in decades. I stepped closer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There was something off about this place, something unsettling. I could feel it in my bones. I hesitated, then pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, and a rush of stale air hit me. Inside, the floor was covered in dirt and dust. Old tools hung on the walls, some rusted beyond recognition. A wooden table sat in the corner, its surface covered in old, dried leaves. But what caught my eye was the large, jagged rock in the center of the room. It didn't look like it belonged there, and it was placed too deliberately for it to be an accident. I stepped closer to examine it, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I heard the sound again, the dragging noise, but this time it was much closer. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something was there. Something was moving in the woods around me. I quickly turned and ran back toward the cabin, not looking back. My heart raced as I pushed through the dense underbrush, my mind spinning. I had to get back. I had to leave. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and drew the curtains. I sat by the window, staring out into the darkening woods, my mind racing. What was out there? What had I found? My thoughts spun in circles, but no answers came. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there much longer. As the night wore on, the dragging noise continued, growing closer and closer. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Every noise, every creak of the cabin, made me jump. I kept thinking I saw something out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing. The silence was unbearable now, the stillness pressing down on me like a weight. By morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things quickly, my hands shaking as I stuffed clothes and food into my bag. I wasn't sure what had happened, but I knew I couldn't stay. The forest had a way of closing in on you, making you feel small, insignificant, and I didn't want to find out what else might be hidden there. I left the cabin behind, driving away without looking back. The road out was just as desolate as when I arrived, the trees stretching endlessly in every direction. But I didn't care. I was glad to be leaving, glad to be away from whatever I had stumbled upon in those woods. Whatever it was something I didn't want to understand, and I never went back. The first thing I noticed when I drove up to the cabin was how quiet it was. The trees surrounding the place were thick, their tall trunks and branches reaching out like silent watchers, casting long shadows over the dirt road that led up to the small, weathered house. The cabin had been sitting alone in the woods for years, or at least that's what the realtor told me. It looked like it hadn't seen much action. Its wooden boards faded and cracked, some of the window panes broken or missing altogether. I'd been told it was isolated, perfect for someone looking for peace and a bit of solitude. I figured I could use both. The city had been wearing me down, and the noise never stopped. I needed to reset, clear my head, get back to something simple. I wasn't exactly sure what I expected out here, but I didn't think it'd be this quiet. I parked my car near the porch and grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat. The air felt different out here, cleaner, but also heavier, like the world had stopped spinning just for a moment. I breathed it in, the smell of pine and wet earth filling my lungs. Inside, the cabin was just as old as it looked from the outside. The walls were covered in dark wood, and the floors creaked under my boots. There was a wood stove in the corner, and a few pieces of mismatched furniture scattered around the room. The windows were all framed in layers of dust and grime. There was a smell, too. It wasn't bad, but it was a mix of old wood, musty air, and something else I couldn't quite place. It wasn't unpleasant, just odd. The cabin had a small kitchen area with an old-fashioned stove, a rusty fridge, and some cabinets that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. I set my things down on the kitchen counter and decided to get a fire going in the stove to take the chill out of the air. The wood was stacked neatly beside it, and though I wasn't exactly a pro at starting fires, I figured I could manage. It took a while, but eventually, the flames caught, crackling and hissing as the heat began to fill the room. As night began to fall, the light outside shifted from pale to dark. The shadows in the woods grew longer, and the trees seemed to close in around the cabin. I didn't think much of it. I was alone, but I had the fire to keep me company. I sat by it, watching the flames dance in the stove, and let my thoughts wander. I'd brought a book with me, one I had meant to read for months, and I figured now was as good a time as any to start. But as the minutes stretched into hours, I found myself glancing up from the pages more and more, distracted by the silence outside. It wasn't until the wind picked up that I started to feel uneasy. It began softly, but then grew louder, like a hum that vibrated through the walls of the cabin. I thought nothing of it at first, but when I heard a crack, like something breaking in the distance, my hand froze over the pages of the book. I listened. Nothing. I chalked it up to the wind and forced myself to focus again on the story in front of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence had returned, only now it felt heavier. The kind of silence that's almost too quiet, like the world is holding its breath. Around midnight, the wind kicked up again, this time much stronger, howling against the windows. I glanced around the cabin, the faint glow of the fire throwing long shadows across the walls. I'd been sitting there for hours, the fire crackling beside me, yet the whole place still felt wrong. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe I was just overthinking things. Either way, I figured I'd turn in for the night. I moved upstairs to the small bedroom. The bed was covered with an old quilt, its edges frayed and worn. The floorboards creaked as I crossed the room and slid under the heavy covers. It didn't take long for me to fall into a fitful sleep, but I woke up several hours later, startled by the sound of something tapping against the window. First, I thought it was just the wind. The branches of the trees could easily have been swaying in the breeze, brushing up against the glass. But the tapping didn't stop. It was rhythmic, consistent. I lay there, frozen, listening. My heart started pounding in my chest, my mind racing. Couldn't be just the wind. I had to check. I slowly got out of bed, careful not to make any noise. The cabin felt even colder now, like the warmth from the fire downstairs hadn't made it up here. I grabbed the flashlight that I'd placed on the nightstand and crept to the window. I hesitated before pulling the curtain back. When I finally did, the beam of light from the flashlight swept across the darkened trees. Nothing, no one, just the sway of the branches in the wind. The tapping stopped. I let out a slow breath. Of course, it was just the wind. I had worked myself up for nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The tapping had stopped, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, the wind, the trees. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of smoke. My first thought was that the fire downstairs had died down and needed attention. But when I opened the bedroom door, I saw that the hallway was filled with a thin haze. It wasn't thick, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. I rushed downstairs and checked the stove. The fire was still going strong, but the smoke was coming from somewhere else. It wasn't coming from the stove, it was coming from the other side of the cabin. I moved through the living room, careful not to trip over the furniture in the low light. The smoke was heavier here, and I could see the faint glow of orange against the back wall. I found the source quickly, the old chimney. There were black streaks of soot running down the wall beneath it, and the wood paneling was scorched. Panic flooded my chest. I rushed to the front door, fumbling with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The wind outside was fierce, and it felt like the cabin was holding its breath again. I tried the door again, but it was stuck. I turned around, my mind racing. I had to get out. I checked the windows next, but they were all locked tight. Everything was sealed. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I was trapped. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel the heat from the smoke creeping up behind me. I couldn't stay here. I had to do something. I had to get out. I ran to the back of the cabin, checking the door there. It opened easily. I didn't waste any time. I threw open the door and stepped into the thick smoke outside. My legs were weak, and my eyes stung from the acrid air, but I didn't stop to look back. I ran into the trees, the smell of burning wood filling my nose. It felt like hours before I reached the clearing. My throat was raw, and my eyes burned from the smoke, but I kept going. I didn't stop until I found the old dirt road that led back to the main highway. I collapsed against a tree, breathing heavily, tears stinging my eyes. I never went back to that cabin. In the end, it turned out that the chimney had been clogged. A buildup of soot had caught fire during the night. There had been a small, contained blaze that could have easily spread to the rest of the cabin if I hadn't woken up when I did. The realtor never mentioned anything about the chimney being a problem. But then again, I never asked. I'm just glad I made it out in time. I'd rented a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a place to escape the noise and demands of everyday life. I had no particular reason to pick this cabin. It was just the first one I found when searching online. The listing mentioned it was secluded, peaceful, and away from it all. Perfect, I thought. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a roof over my head, a place to be alone and quiet for a while. When I arrived, the first thing that hit me was how still everything was. The kind of silence you don't get in a city. There was no hum of distant traffic, no voices in the background, not even birds chirping, just the rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional crack of a branch. The cabin itself was small, just one room with a loft, a wooden structure old but well kept. It was exactly what I expected from a cabin in the woods, a bit worn, but comfortable, the kind of place that's lived in but not by anyone in a long time. I unloaded my bags and took a look around. There was a fireplace in the corner, a small kitchen with a few basic appliances, a table with 2 chairs and a couch. The loft had a bed, a simple mattress with a worn quilt on top. It all felt cozy, but in that strange, isolated way, like the cabin was too far from anything to feel truly homey. I decided to take a walk before dark. There were a few trails around the cabin, or so I was told by the owner when I picked up the key. I grabbed my jacket, slipped on my boots, and stepped outside. The air was cool but not too cold, and the ground was soft from recent rain. I didn't have a particular route in mind. I just walked. As I moved deeper into the woods, I started to notice things. The way the trees bent in odd angles, their trunks twisted as if trying to reach the sky. The way the wind howled through the branches, a sound that felt like it could swallow you whole if you listened too long. It was peaceful, yes, but also a bit unsettling. The quiet was deeper than I'd expected. I passed a few old, weathered signs along the trail, markers for hikers, I assumed, but there was no one around, not a soul in sight. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't like hearing footsteps behind me or anything obvious like that. It was more of a presence, like someone was standing just out of sight, waiting. I turned around several times, half expecting to see someone, but every time, the path behind me was empty. I laughed it off. It was probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks. I'd been alone in the cabin for only a few hours, and already I was starting to feel strange. Maybe I needed to sleep or eat something, anything to take my mind off the nagging feeling. After an hour or so, I decided to head back to the cabin. The sun was starting to set, and the shadows in the trees were growing long. The quiet seemed thicker now, almost oppressive, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I couldn't help but quicken my pace, eager to get back to the safety of the cabin. When I arrived, the place seemed even quieter than before. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The warmth from the fire still lingered in the air, but there was something off. The room looked the same as I'd left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I glanced around, expecting to find something amiss. But there was nothing. I shrugged it off and decided to start a fire in the hearth. It wasn't cold enough yet for the heat to be necessary, but the flickering flames would provide some comfort. I gathered the kindling, lit a match, and soon the fire crackled to life. I sat down on the couch, pulling a blanket around my shoulders as I stared into the flames. I tried to relax, but the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone wouldn't go away. Hours passed, and night settled in around me. The cabin grew darker, the fire casting long shadows across the walls. I cooked myself a simple meal and ate it slowly, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept hearing sounds outside, things that I couldn't quite identify. A rustling in the bushes, the snap of a twig. Once, I even thought I heard someone whispering, but when I checked, the forest was silent again. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe the sounds of small animals moving around outside. But deep down, I couldn't be sure. Around midnight, the quiet was broken by a louder noise. A thump came from outside, somewhere near the back of the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure what it was, but it didn't sound like any animal I knew. It was too heavy, too deliberate. I froze for a moment, listening. Nothing followed the sound. No more thumps, no rustling, just the silence of the forest. I stood up, my muscles tense, and walked cautiously to the window. I peeked through the blinds, but the darkness outside was thick. I couldn't see anything. No movement, no shapes in the shadows. But the feeling of being watched was stronger now, more palpable. I turned off the lights inside, hoping the darkness outside would make it harder for anyone to see me. The rest of the night passed in fitful silence. I didn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me jump. I stayed on the couch, wrapped in my blanket, listening intently to the night. It wasn't until the first light of dawn that I finally managed to fall into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up to find everything just as it had been the night before. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only ash in the hearth. The cabin was still, but now I could hear the faint sounds of birds outside. Real birds, not the strange noises of the night before. I tried to shake off the tension, convinced that I had just let my imagination get the better of me. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning up, cooking breakfast, and reading a book. The day passed slowly, but there was still an unease in the air, like something was lingering just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, but it kept creeping up on me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to take another walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. I walked the same trail I had taken the day before, but this time, I made it a point to stay alert. The trees seemed denser now, the shadows darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, though every time I turned around, I saw nothing. I was about to turn back when I saw something unusual, a set of footprints in the mud. They were large, much larger than my own, and they seemed to lead off the path into the woods. They were fresh, the mud still damp. My heart skipped a beat. I followed the tracks for a few minutes, but they led nowhere. They just vanished into the thick undergrowth. I couldn't make sense of it. It was as though the person had just disappeared, or maybe they'd been watching me, too, and had simply stepped off the path to avoid being seen. I didn't like it. I turned around and walked back to the cabin faster than before, my pulse racing. When I got back, I locked the door behind me and made sure all the windows were shut tight. I didn't know what was going on, but something was wrong. The feeling that I wasn't alone was stronger than ever. Night fell again, and I didn't leave the cabin after that. I spent the evening sitting by the fire, the crackling of the wood the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. Every few minutes, I'd look out the window, half expecting to see someone standing there. I didn't know if I was being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until the morning came that I finally felt like I could breathe again. The sun was rising, and with it came a sense of relief. I packed my things and left the cabin, not looking back once as I drove away. I don't know who was out there in the woods or what they wanted, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I didn't even care to tell the owner about it. I just wanted to leave and put it all behind me. As I drove back to the nearest town, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind me. I wasn't sure what had happened, or if it was all in my head, but one thing was clear. I wouldn't be going back to that cabin again. The woods were beautiful, but they were also full of things you couldn't see, things that watched and waited. I wasn't sure what kind of place that cabin was, but I'd learned enough. Sometimes, the quiet can be more terrifying than any noise. I had been looking forward to a week of solitude. The idea of spending a few days in a secluded cabin, away from everything, work, city noise, the constant barrage of messages, sounded like the perfect reset. So, I rented the cabin deep in the woods, tucked away far enough that there was no chance of an easy drive-by or even a neighbor close enough to wave at. It was exactly what I needed: peace, isolation, and a chance to clear my head. The drive there was long, winding through narrow country roads and thick forests. It was late afternoon when I finally pulled up to the cabin, the golden light of sunset filtering through the trees. The cabin was just as I had imagined: rustic, made of dark wood, with a stone chimney and a small porch. There were no neighbors in sight, just miles and miles of wilderness stretching in every direction. The only sounds were the chirps of birds and the rustling of leaves. I took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp air. There was something about being that far from the world that felt so freeing. I grabbed my bag from the trunk, feeling a mix of excitement and relief as I approached the cabin. Inside, the place was as simple as it looked from the outside. A small kitchen, a wood stove, a couple of chairs, and a large stone fireplace. The walls were adorned with old, weathered wooden beams, and the floors creaked slightly as I walked across them. It smelled like wood, earth, and something faintly musky, as if the cabin had been untouched for a long time. The first thing I did was unpack. I put my food in the small fridge and set up a few things in the living room. Some books, my phone, which I didn't plan on using much, and a couple of movies I'd brought along for entertainment. There was no Wi-Fi, no signal, nothing to distract me. That was part of the appeal. After settling in, I decided to take a walk. I figured I might as well explore the area and get my bearings before it got dark. The woods around the cabin were thick and dense, with trees towering above and casting long shadows across the ground. The air was cooler now, the sun dipping lower in the sky. I followed a narrow trail, marked only by the occasional rock or bent tree. It wasn't much of a trail, just a path that seemed to have been made by other hikers or maybe wildlife over the years. There was something oddly comforting about being out here, away from everything. The only thing that seemed to exist in that moment was the whisper of the wind and the crunch of the leaves beneath my boots. I didn't know how far I had walked when I realized that the trail was starting to look less like a path and more like a scattered series of markers. Broken branches, bits of moss on rocks, a large fallen tree. I stopped and glanced around. It didn't feel wrong, but something about the area felt off. The air was heavier now, more still. There was a quiet that made the whole forest feel strangely empty. I should have turned back. I knew I should have, but I kept going. Curiosity got the better of me. The trail seemed to curve around something, a small clearing. As I approached, I saw a large, flat rock, almost perfectly rectangular. There were no other rocks like it around, no outcroppings nearby. It stood out, stark against the dirt and leaves. I stepped closer. The rock looked strange, almost like it had been placed there deliberately. As I touched it, I noticed something odd. Scratches along its surface, as if something had been dragging across it. They were too deliberate to be natural. My pulse quickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something about it didn't sit right. My mind started to race. I turned quickly, retracing my steps, moving faster now, the path back feeling longer than I remembered. The forest around me seemed darker, the trees closing in, like they were watching. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had fully set, and I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. I leaned against it for a moment, trying to calm myself. It was nothing, I told myself, just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was off about that rock. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the warmth of the fire as I started the wood stove and settled in for the night. The night was quiet, too quiet. The wind had died down, and even the usual night sounds of the woods were absent. The only sound in the cabin was the crackling of the fire. I tried to watch a movie, but my mind kept drifting back to the clearing, to that strange rock. I couldn't stop thinking about the scratches on it, the feeling of being watched. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, every small noise making me jump. The wind picking up outside sounded like whispers, and the trees creaked and groaned as if something was moving through them. I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to ignore the unease growing in my chest. The next morning, I decided I would head out again, but this time, I would stay closer to the cabin. I grabbed my coffee and sat on the porch, the sun just starting to rise. The air was cold, but it felt good, like it might clear my head. I hadn't planned on going back to the rock, but my curiosity was gnawing at me. What if it was nothing? What if I was just overthinking things? I walked the same path as before, but when I reached the clearing, I stopped. The rock was still there, but something was different. The scratches were deeper now, as if they had been carved recently. And there, on the edge of the stone, was a small pile of dirt, almost like something had been dug into the ground. I knelt down and touched it, and the earth shifted under my fingers. It wasn't natural. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. That was when I saw it, footprints. Not human, but something larger. The prints were deep, as if something heavy had walked across the ground, dragging its feet. They led away from the rock, toward the trees. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran back to the cabin, locking the door behind me again. My mind was racing. What had made those prints? What had been at that rock? The rest of the day passed in a blur. I stayed inside, pacing, thinking. I didn't want to go outside again. The idea of spending one more night in that cabin, knowing what was out there, terrified me. But I was stuck. My phone had no signal, and the only way to leave was to drive back down the winding roads I had come up. And to do that, I needed to get my car out of the driveway, which was miles away, at the edge of the woods. I spent the day preparing. I packed everything, made sure my keys were in hand, and got the car ready. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky again, and I couldn't stay another night. The fear had settled in my chest, cold and heavy, but I couldn't leave without knowing if something had followed me. I decided I would make one last trip out to check the area and see if there was any sign of whatever had been near the rock. I grabbed a flashlight and went out once more. This time I wasn't alone. I kept the light on the ground, following the prints. The deeper I got into the forest, the more I felt something was moving just out of sight. Every snap of a twig made me jump, but I forced myself to keep walking. It didn't take long before I found what I was looking for. A small clearing with fresh, disturbed earth. Something had been dug up here recently. The ground was soft, but there was no sign of anything else. It wasn't until I stepped closer to the edge of the clearing that I saw it. A piece of cloth, torn and stained, caught on a branch. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was torn from something large, something strong. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay there any longer. I turned back to the cabin, my breath quickening with every step. I made it back to the driveway, climbed into my car, and drove as fast as I could, never once looking back. The fear didn't leave me until I hit the main road, far from the cabin. I never went back. The cabin, the rock, the footprints, they all stayed with me. I could never explain what I found or what I felt, but I knew one thing. Sometimes, the woods hold things you don't want to see, and I was lucky I'd gotten away when I did. I'd always been the type to seek peace in solitude. It wasn't that I didn't like people. I just preferred my own company. So when I found a small, rustic cabin deep in the woods for rent, I jumped at the opportunity. I wasn't going for a vacation per se, but more for the quiet. The kind of quiet where all you can hear are the sounds of nature. Wind through the trees, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. That's all I wanted. A weekend alone with my thoughts. The cabin was a little smaller than I imagined, but that added to its charm. It was built of dark, weathered wood, the kind that blended perfectly with the surrounding forest. The roof had a few missing shingles, but nothing too serious. The place was a good hour's drive from the nearest town, so I knew I wouldn't be seeing anyone, which was perfect. When I arrived, I unloaded my bags, set up my stuff in the small living area, and looked around. The inside had a certain smell to it, wood, a little dampness, maybe a bit of mildew from being shut up for the winter. It wasn't unpleasant. In fact, I liked it. It felt authentic. I lit a fire in the stone fireplace, unpacked some food, and settled in. It was late afternoon, so I had just enough light to get a fire going and make things comfortable. After the fire was crackling, I went out to the porch with a hot mug of coffee. The evening was just starting to settle in. The sky was painted in dusky hues of orange and purple as the sun sank below the horizon. I leaned back in the old wooden rocking chair and took in the view. The forest stretched for miles, the trees thick and full, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The only sounds were the occasional call of birds settling in for the night and the soft rustle of the trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I liked it that way. That night, I went to bed early. The bed was small, the mattress firm but comfortable enough. I pulled the thick wool blanket up to my chin and closed my eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. There was something about the quiet. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that made you aware of every little noise. The creak of the cabin settling, the whisper of the wind outside. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the warmth of the blanket, the steady crackling of the fire in the other room. But sleep didn't come. Not right away. Eventually, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. First, I thought it was just an animal. It was probably a deer or a raccoon, maybe even a squirrel scurrying through the brush. But then the sound came again. Something heavier. The unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the gravel path leading up to the cabin. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I strained my ears in the dark, trying to make out any further sounds. Nothing. No movement. Just silence. It wasn't normal. A wild animal would have moved on by now, wouldn't it? My heart was beating faster now. The cabin felt much smaller, much more enclosed than it had just a few hours ago. I pulled the covers up tighter, hoping that if I stayed still enough, whatever was outside would go away. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. The longer it went, the more unsettled I became. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But my mind wouldn't let go of the idea that there was something, someone, out there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, moving away from the cabin. Slowly, cautiously, I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath this whole time. My mind raced with questions. Who would be out here? What would they want? I didn't sleep much the rest of the night,